covered wagons, just to be clear. Anyway, nonprofit journalism has been around, for almost 200 years. AP, you recall, started in, I think, 1846. A lot of venerable institutions, Christian Science Monitor, National Geographic, are all nonprofit. I could list all the nonprofits. National Public Radio, PBS, were created in some of our lifetimes here in the last 40 years. And so the idea, there is scalability and there are large budgets and there is swath in terms of coverage. AP, I guess, is the largest news organization in the U.S. in terms of reporters on the street. AP and NPR actually have the largest number of people with bureaus overseas at the moment. So I was going to, my particular interest lately, the last 20 plus years, is investigative reporting and finding a place to do it that is unencumbered by the BS of the commercial newsrooms. Trying to talk succinctly here. And so in the 70s, you started to see some signs of this kind of energy. You heard Mother Jones. Mother Jones became a nonprofit magazine and began in the 70s taking advantage of postal rates and as a notprofit. But the Center for Investigative Reporting was created in 77. The Center for Public Integrity, which I started, was in 89. ProPublica began last year. And then the other thing that started to happen, and those three are all 501c3, tax-exempt, so-called educational organizations, all doing investigative reporting. And I'm happy to go deep on all those, but there's probably not time. But you also then started to see a university formulation of this, some as C3s, some inside universities, some with no centers or, just part of the journalism department in some cases. I think the first one that I'm aware of, or one of the first, was David Protest with his Innocence work at the Medill School at Northwestern, which is part of the journalism school there, but also works with the law school. You have Lowell Bergman, who I worked with at ABC and CBS, who has been teaching at Berkeley for about 18 years, but in the last 5 to 6 years, started to do investigative reporting with Frontline and the New York Times, working with for-profits and nonprofits from a university construct using students and the other infrastructure at universities. You have Florence Graves, who founded Common Cause magazine, which was the biggest muckraking circulation magazine in the United States in '87, won the National Magazine Award. She's now started and runs the Schuster Institute for Investigative Journalism at Brandeis. You have Walter Robinson, a terrific journalist from the Boston Globe, now working at Northeastern University with grad students, working with the Boston Globe. Florence works with the Globe and the Washington Post and others. You have Sheila Coronel, the Stabile Center for Investigative Journalism at Columbia. Folks like Walt McDonough, who's won 3 Pulitzers at the New York Times, works and teaches there as an adjunct. And that center is a useful intellectual ferment place for public service journalism. I have started in the last year the investigative reporting workshop at American University, along with Berkeley. We're the only other school in the country that's going to be producing documentaries with Frontline, co-producing and doing other things. And we have an iLab that is going to be looking at new models. And I've been writing myself about some of those models, which I'm happy to talk about, but there's probably not time. I'll keep moving. There are new investigative centers that have cropped up just in the last 3 or 4 years. Voice of San Diego, many of you have heard about. Earlier today, we heard MinnPost mentioned, run by Joel Kramer, a former publisher of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. We have the New England Center for Investigative Reporting right here with Joe, who will talk later, that started this year, officially, I believe. And full disclosure, I'm on the advisory board. We have the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism. Both of these are at universities. This is at Boston University, within Boston University. Tom Fiedler is the new dean there, former Miami Herald editor. You have the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism, which is at the University of Wisconsin, but is actually a C3 in their case. And you have right now activity that looks like there will be new nonprofits formed to do investigative reporting. I think perhaps because we're still watching, Florida, Texas, California, Illinois, and Washington State What does it mean? It means that by year's end, we're going to have 18 to 20 investigative reporting nonprofit centers throughout the United States, local, state, regional, and national. And this is a slightly ornery formulation, but if you add up the budgets of all these groups, it may exceed what the I-teams of the leading newspapers in their heyday spent for investigative reporting. The numbers, there's a new study coming out by Jan Schaefer at JLab, which is also at American University. Something like $128 million spent on journalism initiatives by foundations and individuals in the U.S. since 2005. So there's starting to be significant resources devoted to this. The only good news about all the bad news about journalism is that community foundations and donors and other folks have started to realize there may be a civic problem here. I have not mentioned many other nonprofits, some of whom are here. The Capital News Connection, 27 states have no coverage of their congressional delegations here in Washington, and groups like that one and others are tracking stuff. We have expert investigative coverage of the National Security. The National Security Archive has been around for almost 30 years. Is that an NGO or is that a news organization? Well, I don't know. They have the best documents that I ever see on national security that are unearthed on a regular basis. I don't know what we call them. And then you have TRAC, the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse. You can see why the acronym is used here. At Syracuse University, run it and founded by Susan Long and David Burnham, the great New York Times journalist and author. That does magnificent stuff with millions of records, takes census and other data and makes it comprehensible and breaks it out in wonderful ways. Those are all journalistic enterprise. And one of the issues ahead is I hate to use the term standards and practices. What is the news organizations? What if opposition research people for the two parties begin to start news organizations? Gosh, could that happen? Gosh, I can't imagine. And so there is an awful lot occurring, of course. You have the blogosphere, which is recently discovered investigative reporting. It's very exciting. And so as the blogosphere and some key leading blogs, and respectable blogs, I mean, TPM winning the Polk Award for the U.S. Attorney's stories that they did with the help of crowdsourcing, using the public to read thousands of pages in an efficient manner. Some really great innovations. I don't mean to poo-poo those innovations, but as we all know, blogging for the most part, you would not say that investigative reporting content has been its strength particularly, at least I wouldn't. It's starting to change, though, and so that form is changing also. And, of course, those are all nonprofits for the most part. I don't think there's too many, with the exception of Huffington and a few others, making serious money. So the other thing about standards and practices, I think there's going to start to be a new thought process, I hope, about transparency and openness. I think it's useful for all these groups to have certain basic standards, bios of who their journalists are, which is revealing sometimes. If possible, a mission statement about the subjects they're purporting to cover or their geographic area or whatever it is. The 990s from the IRS, it's actually, it sounds like Bellucci or something. It's more of a guideline than a law, but theoretically the IRS says you're supposed to list your 990s for the last 3 years. Almost no one does it, but I think they should. And listing donors. Actually, believe it or not, even for the groups I just mentioned, a good number of them do not list their donors, or at least it's a spotty record on that. I think that as this form morphs into new forms and progresses, I think standards will become an issue, as of course it has occurred with blogs. You now have hundreds of blogs that have formed an association because of all the libels lawsuits they've had. They've suddenly realized they actually have to have some professional news gathering, sorting and sifting standards, or else they'll perish financially and legally, not necessarily in that order. So anyway, I'll stop there. That is sort of what I would recommend as an overview of what's happening with investigative reporting nonprofit centers in particular. What's going to happen next? Stay tuned. I mean, could these groups become something else? Possibly. Are there large national organizations that have noticed all this content being amassed that is no longer being amassed by newspapers? They have. Is it really interesting? Yes, it is. Can I tell you exactly what the future holds? No. But is it going to happen this year? Yes. So stay tuned. I mean, it's a very dynamic area. We have a new ecosystem here that has suddenly occurred to all of us publicly, and it's very exciting. And it's obviously desperately needed. So I'll stop there. And I forget who's officially next.
Can I go next? If I can, maybe okay. I'll go next too, because I can play off of what you just said. Inspired by what Chuck has done on the national scene, we launched in January what is the first investigative reporting collaborative nonprofit university-based focused on local and regional issues. Our goal is to ensure the survival of investigative journalism in our region, which is on a decline as it is in many parts of the country because of a number of reasons. What we're doing essentially is we're doing investigative reporting in collaboration with media partners. We went to media partners early on in this process and we said, we're thinking about doing this. We don't want to give this away for free. We want you to either pay us or donate resources or personnel to this effort. And they agreed. And so we're getting cash from some media partners. We're getting resources from others. The Boston Globe, Boston.com, New England Cable News, WBUR, which is the NPR station in Boston, the Eagle Tribune group of newspapers, which is part of the Community Newspaper Holdings Company, are all partners signed on with us right now. We're having other papers, other media outlets approach us wanting to be partners. We have a plan to regionalize our center beyond Massachusetts. We're talking to media outlets, journalism programs, and foundations in each of the New England states. The second mission, an important one because we're university-based, obviously, is that we want to train a new generation of investigative reporters. So BU students work with us as reporter trainees. We had 9 students working with us last semester. We have a dozen students working with us this summer, more for the fall. We have a high school internship program to bring in inner-city high school kids to work with us at our center to learn about investigative reporting, to learn about the importance of the important role it plays in society, get them involved at a very early age. We're expanding that program. We have more joining us this summer through a program in Boston called Right Boston. We also have an ethnic media partner, New England Ethnic News. One important component of what we're doing is we're trying to make sure that investigative reporting reaches communities that rarely see it, because the newspapers and radio stations and TV stations that cover those communities do not do, for the most part, enterprise or investigative journalism. And so we've linked up with New England Ethnic News, a group that Ellen Hume formed. She's here today. And we're talking to El Planeta, which is the largest circulation Hispanic paper in our area, about joining our collaborative. We are funded, as I said earlier, in part by the media partners, also by the Knight Foundation, a generous grant from the Knight Foundation, individual donors, and a very substantial contribution from BU. We feel that being based at a university is really important because the resources are there for us to work with, not only the resources in terms of them paying for our salaries in part, but also providing the infrastructure for us to operate, the students for us to work with, the brain power in several different areas across numerous spectrums, in the business school, in the health policy school. There's a hospital. And speaking of hospitals, we see ourselves in terms of our mission based in a journalism school, just as a medical school serves a community and trains doctors, we're serving a community through this university-based operation and also training journalists. So it's very much the medical school kind of model in some ways. We are, Maggie Mulvihill and I, the co-director of our center, are considered clinical professors like those doctors that work in medical schools, training doctors as well as doing medicine. Our long-term sustainability plan is probably threefold, if not more. One is to charge a fee eventually from each of our member media partners, a fee for the content that we provide. We hope to boost the number of partnerships to about 20 or 25 in the next year or so. Secondly, to begin thinking about selling customized content, research, just as The Economist does and the Global Post does in Boston. So if someone says, we're interested in this topic, we have students that can do research, we'll do the research and we'll sell that research. It may generate a story, it may not. we're also thinking more along the lines of the NPR model. People joining us as members, and also we're thinking clearly about advertising at some point, but we're not there yet. We're at the second phase of our website development. We have many other projects going on. We're talking about partnering with the Center for Public Integrity. We're already doing some work on a stimulus dollar tracking project with ProPublica, and we're talking about partnering with the Huffington Post. And we hope to do all three. So collaboration, partnership, funding from numerous sources, involving an institution with incredible resources and commitment, those are all part of the model that we've created.
On the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, we're based here in Washington, D.C., and a number of themes and key words that people have been bringing up is a lot what we bring together as well. Collaboration is key in this type of environment. Partners, telling journalists that they need to look at the way that they're working, especially when they're venturing out on their own, is key. And then, of course, as Emily, I think, mentioned it at the very end, creating the informed citizenry and always remembering the public service that journalists have to do. The Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting looks at international news. That is our key focus. So what we do is we provide the funding and commission the journalists to go abroad to cover those stories that are not getting covered here in the mainstream media. I cut my teeth at UPI in the mid-'80s, and UPI sent me abroad, and I met a number of former UPI folks here today as well, to the Middle East and Africa. And that's not being done today to the extent that it was even 10 years ago. International reporting is not front and center on the media. And what the Pulitzer Center is trying to do is raise the quality, cover stories that are not getting covered here in the U.S. So we commission reporters to go abroad, 25 to 30 reporting projects a year. We began about 3 years ago. And since then, we've had some 80 reporting projects covering about 60 countries and increasing weekly and monthly. But it's not only about getting the content, which is key. It is also about creating the appetite. And that is the second half of our dual mission, to increase the demand among the general public, but especially targeting and special programs that we've put together focusing on teens and young adults. And more that is being recognized in the community of educators as well. We are very proud to say that we received this year the Asia Society's Goldman Sachs Foundation Prize for Excellence in International Education because of that combination of media, content, and technology and pulling it all together. And at the core of combining the increased content and focus on international news and increasing the appetite and demand for that global news is our Global Gateway Educational Initiative. And that's where we bring the reporters, both online and in person, to high schools and to college campuses across the country. And at the core of the Global Gateway program is actually our Pulitzer Gateway portals, which we launched just this past fall and are beginning to develop, where we would like for every reporting component to have an educational component so that the next generation of whether journalists, policymakers, general public, will connect with international issues, policy decisions that they will have to make at the national level, or also to look at the local connections so that they can answer, why should I care about global news? Why should I know what's going on around the world? See how it connects to their local issues. So for us, again, the combination of collaborating with multiple media outlets, crossing multiple platforms, experimenting and seizing technological opportunities are key as far as working with our journalists and making sure that they're not just print reporters, making sure that they're not just videographers, but they know how to mesh all sides of journalism. And then taking it to the next level, taking it to that level where you go in and you talk to folks and you connect the journalists and you connect the global issues in curriculum development, working with educators. We have begun also a campus consortium with universities, partnering with universities so that we can bring journalists there, so that they can integrate global news into curriculum, not only as a training ground for the journalists at the journalism departments, but looking at the business schools and looking at the schools of foreign service who are going to be going off and needing not only the content, but the context of what is going on in the world around them.
Ann, thanks. I wonder if we could go to Curtis next, just because I think you sort of pick up on a theme that Ann had started.
I pick up on a part of the theme.
Okay.
Although, we have one thing in common. We both cut our teeth on UPI, although I did it in the 60s and you did it in the 80s. I didn't bring my dinosaur costume, but some of you may think that's where I come from. Because some of what I'm going to say is cross-cutting to what we've been talking about. What I'm about is to try to resuscitate the print-on-paper newspaper industry by restoring readership at the intersection of what I deal with a lot, which is civic illiteracy and civic disengagement. We all know why newspapers are failing. There are fewer readers, and therefore there are fewer advertisers, and they can charge less, and we have a recession, and there are even fewer advertisers. When newspapers are going out of business, some of corporations are bankrupt, bureaus are disintegrating, people are going online. Why we've had a decline in readership is partially technology, television, cable, satellite, the internet, Facebook, iPods, and all these things that create increasingly narrow personal communities. But the other part lies in our educational system. We have higher education has gone to emphasize graduate and professional education, thanks to Clark Kerr, at the expense of undergraduate education and a sense of community. The ideas of citizenship education in 1 through 12 that John Dewey put forward has gone essentially by the wayside. If you're lucky in those 12 years, you get one course in U.S. history and one course in civics. We no longer read either weekly or daily newspapers in classes and study, debate, and test on current events. And the result is that college freshmen score 56 out of 100 on the average on a test in civic knowledge. College seniors score 58, and that speaks nothing about the 60% of the young people who don't go to college. The way to reverse that is to use that institution called the school. And the way to do that is a large idea that can be implemented. We should add civic knowledge and current events testing to No Child Left Behind. If you do that, you force a curriculum in civic knowledge and current events from the 3rd grade to the 12th, which could and should include newspaper reading, which would provide a legitimate way of subsidizing newspapers that did not interfere with editorial freedom and would geometrically increase circulation. It would also lead to a reading habit that could last a lifetime for those of us who had that reading habit developed in us and would not sacrifice the print-on-paper newspaper. And it would change the whole context of civic knowledge and civic literacy. The question is, why not do it via the internet? Well, the internet is a very different medium. As Jeff pointed out earlier today, only 1% internet viewing, only 1% goes to news sites. People who go to news sites stay there for 1.5 minutes. They read newspapers for 40. People graze the internet, they read newspapers. The newspaper acts as a super-ego of the id of unfettered publication. The newspaper invites you to read not only a story, but its analysis, its editorial, and other things within that framework. The newspaper creates community, the internet creates fragmentation. That is not to say that the internet is not terribly worthwhile for a lot of things, but it is to say that we sacrifice the one journalistic institution that is a community and integrating institution at our peril. Several years ago, Neil Postman, the late Neil Postman, wrote a wonderful book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, in which he talked about how entertainment values were overtaking news values and serious citizenship values in our media. Now we have the problem not only of entertainment, but of fragmentation. Saving the newspaper, print-on newspaper industry can be done, and because of what Dan Kennedy said there about not saving the industry, but creating an educated citizenry, it should be done.
Thanks, Curtis. Jay, you wrote the book on this called All the News That's Fit to Sell. You've done a lot of thinking about how to connect that social good of information that we need to be effective citizens in a democracy against the commercial requirement to stay in business. How do you take that based on the conversations we've been having today? How do you strike that balance, and how does the privacy piece fit in that I know you're spending a lot of time on now?
Sure. If you think about the information demands everybody in this room has, there are really four of them. Producer, things we need to know to do our jobs. Consumer, things that help us figure out what we want to buy. Entertainment, things that are just interesting to know. And voter information, things that help us make a better voting decision. The first three markets work pretty well. If you don't get the information, you don't get the benefit. So if you're going to buy a car, you might go to Edmunds.com. There's something different about that fourth information demand, which is why we're all here today, because most people remain rationally ignorant about the details of politics from an individual perspective. Why do I say rationally ignorant? If I spent a month reading about the stimulus package, I wouldn't get a better stimulus package because I'm not the marginal decision maker. I'm not the marginal voter. So many people do not consume public affairs coverage, even though it has positive impacts on their life. They're free riders. Newspapers have always provided goods that they can't fully monetize. Economists call those positive externalities. 120 years ago, the party subsidized the press because of that. 30 years ago, you had, let's call them people who owned newspapers. And what they were willing to do, families, Sulzberger, Grahams, things like that, they were willing to provide more than a profit-maximizing amount of public affairs coverage. Today, the internet makes that impossible. Price equals marginal cost on the internet, and the marginal cost of a more page view is zero. So what we're trying to do at Duke is focus on maintaining accountability or watchdog coverage, because we think that's, especially at the local level, that's where the biggest market failure is. That's the type of news coverage that's most at risk. So we'd like to spark four debates, many of which were mentioned today. Number one is nonprofit ownership or nonprofit subsidies for the creation of information. And Chuck has been involved in innovative discussions about the L3C Corporation, for instance, a new organizational form that would collect both people with a social investing motive and people after a market rate of return. A second way to maintain the watchdog function is to actually lower the cost of doing investigative reporting through what we're calling computational journalism. The Knight Foundation has sponsored the first chair in computational journalism in the U.S. at Duke, and Sarah Cohn from the Washington Post is going to take that position up July 1st. And what she's going to try to do is develop a set of open source tools that would help investigative reporters, especially at the local level, do their job more easily. The third solution is monetizing the attention of the segment of people who are already interested in public affairs reporting. And that's what you're talking about today, basically behavioral advertising. If you ask people who's concerned about the future of journalism, and then you overlay that with a set of people who say that they are privacy purists, unfortunately, that's maybe the Venn diagram that you get. What we would like to see is more of a debate where people perhaps might be willing to trade off some of their privacy if in that trade-off, part of the revenues were going to support the type of journalism that's most at risk, the public affairs journalism that people here are engaged in. And then the fourth debate that we'd like to help spark is the debate about partisan information sources. In the 1990s, especially when a lot of the campaign finance law was written, if you thought about partisan information, it was often negative advertising on television. But in the 2004 or 2008 elections, partisan information might be something like Move On or My Barack Obama. And the academic research shows that that type of partisan information is actually very mobilizing, in part because it enables neighbors to talk about issues of very personal political interest, and it actually stimulates turnout. So when I look at what we were talking about today, I see a market failure, that there's a difference between what people need to know and what they want to know. That's always existed, but it's most at risk now because you can't do well and do good at the same time. The profit margins have evaporated. So at Duke, what we're trying to do is look at nonprofit alternatives, try to lower the cost through the development of computational journalism, which is essentially taking algorithms and doing more public interest data mining, sparking this debate about behavioral ad targeting. And so in the breakout sessions, I'd be particularly interested in talking with people who have a sense about what the barriers are to behavioral advertising, and then talking more about what Chuck talked a little bit about is people's views about partisan information sources.
Thanks. That's great.